I had the pleasure of seeing him last year at the 105th or 6th Government Research Association annual meeting. And he gave a presentation that was excellent and he wrote this incredible book, which I'm halfway through, called Reinventing America's School. And so we have the privilege to have someone who really talked about how we can create a 21st century education system. David Osborne is the author or co-author of 6 non-fiction books, including Reinventing America's Schools, Creating a 21st Century School System. And again in 1992, bestseller, New York Times bestseller, Reinventing Government. I finally asked him and he finally signed it. That's why I actually had to come out here to sign the darn book. In 2017, after a decade working on it, he also published his first novel, The Coming. This is a historical novel based on the life of explorer William Clark Nez versus Son that won a Spur Award from the Western Writer of America as the best historical novel of the year. David spent the better part of his childhood in California, but ended up in Massachusetts and has lived here for almost 40 years now. He has 4 children and lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, with his wife Christine, and their dogs, cat, and bird. David, his best-selling book, Reinventing America's School, is back there. It's not only available for purchase, but he'll sign it. We do not want to take any back with us, so buy many. But if you are to, he let the tax or staff member know that the books are available. It's $20. Cash or check, and you're willing to sign it. I can tell you, personally, it's extraordinarily filled with a lot of compelling stories and information that's backed up not by ideas alone, not by just theories and thoughts, but by evidence. Facts, figures, and evidence, and real stories that are transforming not just kids' lives, but communities. And I think there's a lot that we can take from this in Florida, because you've got traditional public schools, you've got charter public schools, you've got private schools employing taxpayer support for them. The key element of all this is how do we make sure they perform for the kids? And when they fail, they don't just fail with students, the parents, and taxpayers. Like in business, when you fail, your business goes out of business, or you lose a lot of money. And he's trying to ensure that we do the same kind of thing for our schools so that we get the kind of dynamic results that really improve kids' lives, no more excuses. And that is in large measure what we're doing. I'm sorry not to be able to stay to see, but what we're doing with our Tax Watch Principal Leadership Awards, we're helping identify ways that these principles are transforming kids' lives in the communities in which they serve. There's no excuses. Everyone child is learning, and that's going to be part of the story. So without further ado, let's welcome David Osborne.
Thank you, Dominic. Can you all hear me back there? Good. It's great to be with you. As Dominic said, I've known him for almost 30 years. And he's quite a crusader for more effective and efficient government. He asked me to talk about urban public education today, which is what my focus is about. And I'm going to tell you what I think we need to do to transform our urban public school systems. But before I do, I want to start off with a simple question. So, if in your city where you work or live, there were an earthquake or a flood or some natural disaster that basically wiped out the schools, when you rebuild, would you rebuild the same system? How many of you would rebuild the same system, public school system? Exactly. One city got that chance, City of New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And I want to tell you a little about it. This was one of the very worst school systems in the country, probably the most corrupt. 24 district officials were indicted before and after Katrina for corruption, including the chairwoman of the school board who took a $150,000 bribe to buy a certain curriculum. more important, the quality was abysmal. Kids were graduating, barely able to read. 40% of the adults in New Orleans in 2004 could not read beyond the elementary school level. So the story began in 1992 when a local businesswoman, a woman named Leslie Jacobs, who with her brother ran an insurance agency, she got involved with one school, helped partner, mentor, turn it around, decided to run for the school board, got elected in 1992. And for 4 years, she beat her head against the wall, trying to get her colleagues to do something. She wanted them to reconstitute failing schools, close them down, get a new principal, hire new staff, and start over. Got nowhere. She's a very determined woman, so after 4 years, she got herself appointed to the State Board of Education. And there she drove a new accountability system, similar to what you've got here in Florida. You know, test scores, standards, grades for schools. And in Louisiana, you can't go from 4th to 5th grade, I think 8th to 9th, and you can't graduate high school without passing a certain test, a 10th grade test. Well, in 2003, at one of the historic high schools in New Orleans, the valedictorian couldn't pass that test. At the time, it was at a 7th grade level. Took the test 5 times, couldn't pass. And there was no protest, there were no voices raised, and Leslie Jacobs decided, we gotta do something more radical. Now, being a business person, she thought about bankruptcy as sort of what we need. We need some way to put a school into bankruptcy and let it start over without all the rules, without all the contracts, and start fresh. So she invented something, and this was a first nationally, called a recovery school district, a statewide school district that could take over the very worst schools, public schools in the state, and hand them to charter operators to see if they could do better. So by 2 years later, when Katrina hit, they had taken over 5 schools in New Orleans. But after Katrina, she evacuated with her family, and she went to the state superintendent and said, we cannot let this district reopen these schools. It would be criminal. So she proposed that they write a state law, get it passed, saying that any public school in New Orleans performing below the state average would go into the recovery school district. That happened to be more than 100 schools, all but 17 schools in New Orleans. Well, you can imagine that's a hugely controversial thing to do. In most of the country, that would never pass the state legislature. But New Orleans was so bad and so corrupt, and there was $300 million they couldn't account for, they couldn't get a clean audit. Both parties in the legislature were completely fed up. The governor, a Democrat, who got elected with teachers' votes and New Orleans votes, she supported it, and it passed. So they started taking over schools. As kids came back, slowly. Fortunately, they had a high bar for quality. They wouldn't give just anybody a charter. And just in case there's anybody in the room who doesn't know what a charter school is, you probably all do, but it's a public school. It's not a private school, but it operates independently of the bureaucracy. It's not within a state, a district bureaucracy. There are rules that affect charters. They can't discriminate, they have to take the state tests, et cetera, but most of the rules from a district don't apply. They're publicly funded, they can't charge tuition, they're open to all comers, they can't select their students, but they're free to design their own learning environment. They're free to start over, green sheet or greenfield design. And they're supposed to be accountable for performance. This is where, in many states, they fall down, in many of your districts, they fall down. But ideally, the idea is that the authorizer of that charter school, whether it's a district or it's a state body or it's someone else, will give it 5 years. And if the school's lousy, they won't renew the charter and the school will have to close. So everyone working at that school knows if these kids aren't learning, our jobs go away. They're mostly not-for-profit organizations nationally, but there are for-profits, and most are schools of choice. So it took the Recovery School District close to a decade to turn all of these schools over to charter operators because they wanted quality. And they were careful if a school failed, and inner city public education is really hard. They don't all succeed, no matter how well intentioned. If they failed, they'd close the school and they replaced it with a better operator. Last July, because Leslie got a group together and passed another bill, all of those schools went back to the local district. So there's an elected school board, and it charters all these schools. They've still got, I think, 2 or 3 schools that aren't charters, but they're about to convert. So probably next year they'll be 100% charter. Now they're 98%. And this story is important. I tell it to you because it produced the most rapid improvement in the country, if not in American history. And I could show you, we could spend an hour on data, but I'll just show you a couple of things. This is their test scores on the old test. In 2015, they went to a common core audit test, as many states did, and all the numbers changed. But before then, the top line is the schools that stayed with Orleans Parish. These were the high-performing schools, mostly selective. And many of them became charters, and you can see they improved. The blue line is the state average. This is the percent of kids who were at grade level or above on standardized tests. And then the green line is the Recovery School District's schools in New Orleans. They improved almost 4 times as fast as the state average. Before Katrina, 62% of the kids in public school in New Orleans were in schools rated in the bottom 10% of the state. Now it's down to 8%. Before Katrina, half the kids dropped out. Now, their graduation rate a decade later was 76%, higher than the state rate. Before Katrina, fewer than 1 in 5 went to college. A decade later, 64% of graduates went to college, which is, again, higher than the state rate. So here you have a city, very poor city, about 85% low-income kids, 82% African-American, outperforming its state on the most important metrics, graduation in high school and going to college. It's unique, the only city in the country that can say that. Now, we don't want natural disasters in any more cities, but we have a lot of school districts that are disasters still. So other places are learning from this and doing similar things. In Washington, D.C., way back in 1996, Congress created a public charter school board in D.C. that authorizes charters. Today, 47% of the kids in D.C. go to charters, and that city is the second fastest improving in the country. But I'm going to tell you about another city because it's a little more similar to your situation. This is a city with an elected school board that went more gradually than either D.C. or New Orleans. But in 2005, again, lousy school district, 39% of the kids graduated. The board hired a new superintendent, a guy who'd been in business and then been chief of staff to the mayor, a guy named Michael Bennett, who's now in the U.S. Senate. And the really funny thing is both Michael Bennett and his former boss, John Hickenlooper, they were both running for president. Is there anyone here running for president?
President, yeah.
Anyway, Michael Bennett's a very smart guy. And after a year, he realized just how screwed up his bureaucracy was and just how long it was going to take to change it in any meaningful way. He started closing the worst schools and replacing them with new schools. They had a few charters. They had maybe a dozen charters in Denver at the time. Not that many. There were about 3 that were really outstanding. And in 2008, something really important happened. One of them, the DSST, Denver School of Science and Technology, a high school. It graduated its first class in 2008. And 100% of those kids were accepted to college. This was a first in Denver. I mean, it's now becoming commonplace in different places, but it was a first in Denver. It was so shocking that it became, one of the daily newspapers put it on the front page, big color photo of all those graduates. Because this school has majority low-income kids. That and other things convinced Bennett and his school board, his elected school board, to embrace charters as their fastest route to improvement. So they said to the SST, they said to KIP, and they said to another organization called Strive, as fast as you can open new schools, we'll give you buildings. We'll do everything we can within the law to equalize the funding for charters and district schools. They haven't quite got there, but they improve things. And you replicate as fast as you can. We'll include you as part of our district strategy. They also thought, well, you know, what's really helping these schools is they have autonomy. They can hire and fire, they can determine their educational model, they can decide the length of the school day, the school year, they can decide whether kids need Saturday school. It's all, they have that autonomy. We ought to give that to our schools. So, working with the state senator from Denver, they wrote a bill that allowed innovation schools, where the principal and the teachers get together, they write an innovation plan, ask for waivers to all kinds of rules that get in their way, and when the superintendent signs it, supposedly they get input. Well, you can imagine what happened. This is I don't know how familiar you are with how school districts really run, but they have these very centralized bureaucracies. So I created an innovation school with my teachers, and it would say, we get to buy our own textbooks. I'd call a procurement office and say, our kids are on average 3.5 years behind grade level, so we don't want the standard textbooks, here's what we want. The procurement office would say, oh, we already bought your textbooks. We don't do it that way. And then I would have to fight for 6 months or a year, get the superintendent involved before I could get my own textbooks. This kept happening. They lost some good principals because of it. But over the years, many battles, things got better. But a few years ago, there were still 4 principals who got so frustrated, they got together and they proposed to the board an innovation zone where they would get more autonomy, more of the money to control at the school level, and a nonprofit board overseeing them, which could fight back against the bureaucracy when they ran into those kind of walls. The board agreed. They've since authorized 2 more, so there are now 2, about to be 3 innovation zones in Denver. It's too early to say how they're working, but it's an interesting experiment. So today you've got close to a quarter of the schools in that district in charters, more than 20% in innovation schools. They've created a common enrollment system for all 3 kinds of schools, charters, innovation, and traditional, so that every family can list their top choices, and every family has an equal shot at getting into quality schools. Because as you know, educated middle-class parents often are far better at getting their kids into the good schools than the low-income parents who may not even speak English. There's been a ton of collaboration. The district has learned all kinds of things. I think in the book I have a list of 8 or 10 different innovations that came out of the charter sector and are now commonplace in the district. And what a district that, when all this started, was the slowest improving of the 20 large districts in Colorado. By 2012 became the fastest improving and has continued to do that. I should have had this slide up. Sorry about that. So graduation rates way up, AP tests and courses way up, ACT, every junior in Colorado has to take the ACT test. So it's not optional, they all take it. Their test scores have gone up 3 times as fast, twice as fast as the state average. But the amazing thing that happened in Denver was that when they adopted a common core aligned test in 2015, much more demanding tests, it was the PARC test, if you know the world of testing, requires much more critical thinking and analysis, not just regurgitation of facts. Before 2015, when Denver public schools were ranked statewide, meaning 80% or more of the schools in Colorado perform better, because this is an big urban city with a lot of poor kids. After they switched in 2015 and 16, in elementary you can see the English on the left, math in the middle. They went up into the 40s, huge leap. And in middle school English, they went up above the state average. I don't have middle school math because middle schoolers take about 5 different math classes. So you have to break it down by geometry, algebra, etc. But if you did, I think you'd see the same thing. And the reason why middle school is so strong, whereas in most districts it's the weakest element, test-wise, is because the charters in Denver, oddly enough, are concentrated at the middle and high school level, just because historically it kind of happened that way. And in fact, if you look at academic growth at the middle and high school level, most of it has come from the charters. So, again, city full of poor kids, lots of English language learners, I think of 1/3 English language learners, and yet on some key metrics, they're either approaching or outperforming their state. Now, some cities, charters, as you know, have gotten quite controversial. The teachers' unions hate them because most of them don't unionize. So as they grow, unions shrink. Some cities have decided, let's emulate chartering without calling it that. So my favorite is Indianapolis. 1/3 of their kids go to charters. That created a lot of competition. They outperform the district. So the district leaders, well, activists in the district, including business leaders, finally elected a reform school board, and they got past state legislation allowing them to create something called Innovation Network Schools. Now you look at that description, nonprofits, their own boards, performance agreements with the district, but they're in district buildings and they're counted as part of the district for accountability reasons, their test scores and so on. So it's kind of like charters but within a district. They can become an innovation school in a number of different ways, and there are 20 of them now, almost 1/3 of the schools, 27% of the kids. 5 existing traditional schools have chosen to convert. When you think about that, the teachers and the principal decided, because they so much wanted autonomy, that they would leave the district employment, they would leave the union, they get to keep their benefits, pensions and the like, and that is obviously important. And they would become a nonprofit where they could be fired tomorrow, they no longer have tenure. But they had the confidence that with autonomy they could do a whole lot better. Some of them are brand new startups. Some of them were failing district schools that got shut down, and then an innovation school was started as a nonprofit. And then some were charter schools that decided to become innovation schools because they get a better financial deal. They get the district building, for example. So the good news about this is that from the beginning, they've been the fastest improving set of schools in that district. Indiana's kind of odd. They adopted a Common Core line test in 2015, and then, being a Republican state and not wanting to be Common Core, they changed the test 3 years in a row. So you can see this is a percentage of kids passing both English and math. Even at the state level, it's been going down. That's because the test keeps changing, I think. In the district, it's going down for the same reason, but the middle group is the innovation schools. And they started low because a lot of them were failed schools with really poor kids that got restarted as an innovation school. But they're the fastest improving group. And the second fastest improving group, called State Takeover, those are 4 or 5 schools that the state took over and handed to a charter operator. So those are now charter schools. So this is working. Other cities are doing similar things. Chicago's done it for over a decade. Philadelphia calls them Renaissance schools. Atlanta, Tulsa, San Antonio, Midland, Texas. There's probably more than 10 big cities now that are creating some kind of partnership schools where they're district schools, but they're treated like charters and they're run as nonprofits. I believe what we're seeing here is the emergence of a new model of how we run a public school district. Because the problem with our districts is not the people. I mean, there's always a few people who've retired on the job. But the problem, usually, most of the teachers and most of the administrators, they're hardworking, they want the kids to succeed, they're dedicated, but they are stuck in a system that evolved 100 years ago and that is increasingly dysfunctional in today's world. This is what it looked like 100 years ago. The school districts were what I'd say called unified, meaning everybody works as an employee of the district. Everybody's an employee of one organization. Very hierarchical, very centralized. Has anybody been a public school principal in this room? Well, public school principals, we tell them they're in charge. We ask them to improve the school. In fact, we demand it. We hold them accountable. And then we tell them they can't hire who they want. They can't fire who they want. They can't determine anything about the pay scale. They can't reward anyone financially. They can't change the learning model at the school. They can't change the length of the school day, and they can't change the length of the school year. But turn that school around. It just doesn't work. They don't. They're managers who have two hands tied behind their back. They were one size fits all. You know, when I was coming up, all the public schools it was cookie cutter, all the same. They teach roughly the same thing to every child in the same order. We march through by grades. The control mechanism is rules. Every time something goes wrong, we put in a new set of rules to make sure it doesn't happen again. You guys know where teacher tenure came from? Speaking of one of the most powerful rules in public education, the idea that once you survive the first 2 or 3 years, you get a job for life. You know why we have that in so much of the country? Because 100 years ago, in places like New York and Philadelphia, when the Democrats got control of the school board, they fired the Republican teachers and hired their campaign workers and cronies. And when the Republicans got control, they do the opposite. And that was bad for the kids. So teacher tenure was a progressive reform, only it was a century ago. And today, it's a real obstacle. No one measured performance, and there were no consequences for the adults. There were obviously consequences for the kids, but not for the adults. So with that model, you can see why it wouldn't work in today's world. It's very rigid, it's very hard to change these districts. So many rules. They're so centralized that they disempower their principals and teachers. And people who are disempowered, they gradually give up on the job. It's one size fits all in a world where the kids have changed dramatically. When I was coming up, 80% of the public school students in this country were white. Today, a minority of public school students are white. We have kids speaking different languages, kids coming from different backgrounds, and of course, kids learn differently and are interested in different things. So a one-size-fits-all model just doesn't work very well. We don't have enough choice for today's parents. Everybody in this room is used to lots of choice in their private lives. And then you send your 5-year-old to kindergarten and it suddenly hits you, oh, if you're in a traditional district, I don't have any choice at all. My kid gets assigned to a school and assigned to a teacher. And there's not enough competition in the system to create urgency. It was built as a monopoly system. But part of the genius of American democracy is that we're decentralized. And we can begin to reinvent at the local level and the state level, and we've been doing that. So a new model is emerging. Most people call it a portfolio model because the idea is a district should have a portfolio of different kinds of schools. I loved that term until our opponents began calling us all corporate reformers. And a portfolio model sure sounds like something a corporate reformer would have. So I like to call them 21st century systems. I like to take the moral high ground, if you will. And what I mean by that is a system in which, rather than everybody being an employee of one organization, you have a network of nonprofit schools that are autonomous, that are accountable, that are public, but are operated by independent organizations. The operating authority is decentralized. The schools, the principals get to run the schools. You still have rules about equity and about transportation and about other things to make sure the system is fair for all the kids. But in terms of running that individual school, most of the decisions are at the school level. The control mechanism is no longer rules, it's now results. If you're not producing results, you don't get to continue running that school. Somebody else will get that building. You encourage different kinds of schools for different kids. If you go to New Orleans, or DC in particular, the variety of schools is just astonishing. You know, you've got dual language immersion schools, you've got Montessori schools, you've got project-based schools, you've got STEM schools, you've got performing arts schools, you've got single-sex schools. I mean, I got a list of 30 different models in the book that already exist around the country. Different schools for different kinds of kids. The parents have choices, and the money, the public money follows the choice. So that you as a parent, when you're not happy with a school and you go speak to that principal, the principal knows that you could yank your kids out and a certain number of dollars will leave with them. They tend to listen a little more in that situation. And finally, the monopoly's gone. Schools are competing for their kids and their money. That works because the people who run the schools get to run the schools. It works because families have choices of different models, and different kinds of kids can find a place where they thrive. It works because there's competition, and the schools know that they better please their customers or they're going to lose out. And it works because there's accountability, because people in schools know that if they can't solve their problems, you know, every public school I've been in as a student, or my kids have been in, I can tell you about certain problems that everybody in the building knew about. I had a high school chemistry professor who, he was, I don't know whether it was Alzheimer's or dementia, but we called it senile in those days. My youngest daughter had a 6th grade math teacher who was having the same problem. And everybody in the building knows about this stuff. But they can get away with doing nothing. And doing something is hard because of teacher tenure. And so they do nothing. Well, when you all know that if you do nothing and your kids aren't learning, you're going to lose your charter and you're going to lose your job, you tend to get together and fix the problems. The tough thing we've learned through experience is that it's really hard for elected school boards to impose that kind of accountability on schools full of their employees. Because when you do that, when you close a school for performance, you get a protest not just from that school, you'll get a protest from the whole system, the union will organize it, and the next time you run for re-election, they'll run somebody against you. And you're running in elections with 10% turnout if you're a typical school board. So you're probably going to lose. So they just don't get around to closing those failing schools. But if it's a nonprofit in New Orleans, Denver, DC, what we've seen is that it's not easy to close those schools, but they do it. And they do it because they get a protest from just one building, not from the whole system. And all the other school operators are looking at the situation and thinking, we want to replicate. We want to create another school. There's a building that might be open. Maybe we could get it. So the politics become really different. So that's what I mean by a 21st century school system. And as you've been listening, I'm sure you know that Florida, since Jeb Bush, for the last 20 years, has been moving in this direction with a lot of the statewide reforms. The evidence from the cities I've talked about, from New Orleans, DC, and Denver, says that in any particular city, if you do this, within a decade, you can double the effectiveness of that system for the same dollars. And there's no other reform I've ever seen that has that level of impact at scale. We can change the lives of millions of kids. We just have to have the courage to fight and win the political battles that stand in the way. Thank you. minutes for questions, I think.
This is a tough audience, come on.
Yeah, that day.
I read your book last week and loved it.
Thank you.
Everybody should read it. It's a public service.
And I didn't pay him.
You did not.
This is the innovator, by the way, of our.
So I want, can you do two things for the audience, which will maybe help them pick up the book? Give the restaurant analogy in full.
Okay.
And then also explain the difference. Accountability is the most overused word. Explain to the audience the difference between regulatory and market accountability.
Okay. So,
Repeat the question in case they didn't.
yeah, if you didn't hear it, the first thing he asked me to do was give you my restaurant metaphor. So, somewhere in the book, probably the introduction, I said, you know, if you want to really think about how crazy the way we organize public education is, think about the restaurant business. What if we said to everybody, okay, we've got these free restaurants. You can pay to go to a restaurant, but you can go to these free restaurants. They're only open nine months of the year. And the menu is fixed. You go and you get, you get what they are serving that night. And the waiters and cooks are on salary, and you can't tip them. And if you're unhappy, tough luck. And you're assigned to a local restaurant. I think that's the full metaphor.
You can't fire them.
Pardon?
You can't fire your workers.
Oh yeah, and once your workers survive 2 or 3 years, you can't fire them.
And you pay them based on how long they've been.
Yeah, and every year they get a raise based on longevity. Would that work? No, of course it wouldn't work. That's how we organize public education. That's why Al Shanker, who was president of the American Federation of Teachers and was one of those who invented charter schools, said that of course our system doesn't work very well. It's organized more like the communist economy than like our economy. Second question was, can I talk about the difference between accountability through regulation and accountability through the market? So if everybody has a choice and the dollars follow the choices, then parents can pick good schools for their kids, and all you need is that market mechanism. That will close down really bad schools. That's what I believed 30 years ago when I read The Reinventing Government. I went back and read it, and in the last chapter, that's what I say. It turns out, we've learned through experience that it's not true for all parents. It's true for, I would say, most middle-class parents and above. But if you grew up in Mexico and you went to 6th grade and you don't speak very good English, it turns out, and this is true for all kinds of categories of low-income parents, if the school is safe and warm and nurturing, you're going to be happy. And you won't even know that your kids are falling further behind grade level every year, because the schools don't tell you, right? They make it a point not to tell you that. So we've learned in the charter sector that market accountability isn't quite enough. And if we want every child to get a quality education rather than just a safe, nurturing education, we have to close the worst schools, the ones where the kids aren't learning to read, aren't learning to do math, can't write a paragraph, etc., etc. And that is regulatory accountability. And I'm a firm believer that we need both, based on experience. As I said, 30 years ago, I didn't realize that, but I think we've learned. Any other questions?
David, what are your observations about the charter movement in Florida and the results?
So, Florida has a lot of charters. Chartering is thriving in Florida, but your primary authorizers are districts. And I think the only other authorizer is the state board. I think a school can appeal to the state board.
Rare.
Yeah, and that's fairly rare. So another thing we've learned through experience that we didn't know when all this started, I ran the authorizing office in Dade County. And I think they had a staff of 2 or 3 people. And he basically said, we don't really have time to visit the schools and really look closely at how well they're performing. So a lot of your authorizers do a lousy job when they don't close the lousy charters. And I have some ideas about what you ought to do about that. I think the state should pass legislation that says, if a certain percentage of your charter schools are falling below this performance level, then we're going to create a dedicated charter authorizer in your city, a public charter school board, just like Congress did in DC, and all the charters are going to be authorized by it. And its only job is to authorize charters. I think that would really help, because we've learned through experience that if you have this one huge job and then chartering is a side venture, you're going to be a lousy charter operator 9 times out of 10. There are always exceptions, but 9 times out of 10. But if your only job is authorizing charters, you're probably going to do a better job. There's one other question here.
I think you answered it.
Okay.
The one question I have is capacity. And so using the restaurant analogy, you get bad performance, you can't shut down. And we're sort of at a charter school that's not performing, very difficult to shut it down. You do shut it down, like a restaurant. Does somebody come back in and buy, it's a restaurant building? We all know there's that building that changes every 2 or 3 years, a new restaurant comes in. Is the trend or the norm that another school would come back in, or
Yes.
another operator to
Yes.
that school to backfill the capacity?
Yes, I mean, when charters get shut down, school buildings are precious in most cities. Charters are desperate to get buildings. And so they don't just remain empty. Usually if it's a district building, the district will put a school there, or if it's a charter, some other charter organization will get a charter and use that building. So that's the norm. I mean, again, there are exceptions, but that's the norm. There's one way back there.
I would like to hear your opinion. Earlier during session, I heard of a movement, I don't know really where it ended, of allowing immigrant students whose English wasn't their first language to test in their native tongue to be placed at different levels in the education system. I'd like to know what your opinion of that.
I'm not going to answer that because I don't have that expertise. That's really a pedagogical question, and my expertise is changing public systems. It's not pedagogy. So I won't even try. I'm sorry.
Do you find that operators of successful charter schools tend to replicate it? They open another and another and another charter schools?
They tend to. Not all want to, but many of them do. And, the charter sector, it's so ironic that the teachers' unions call them all corporate reformers, because the truth is, if you get to know people who run charter schools and started charter schools, it's like Peace Corps volunteers from the 60s. I mean, these are very dedicated people working for not a lot of money, working 80 hours a week, trying to help poor kids. They're mission driven. And if you're trying to help poor kids and it works, you probably want to do it again. So many of them do replicate. And the biggest one now, KIP, has 220 or 240 schools now, 100,000 kids. And they're almost all high quality. It's remarkable.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for your comments this afternoon. So there is great value in the charter school approach, but how do we reform the broader system that has the majority of our children, right? And what are some of the tools that are necessary for those who would like to push reform within that system, to have at their disposal, at least for conversations pieces or for advocacy from an advocacy perspective?
Yeah, that was a great question. Did you hear it back there? Yeah. Okay. You use the principles that work: school autonomy, school accountability, diversity of learning models, choice for the parents, within reason. I mean, even in New Orleans, a lot of people want to send their elementary school kid to a local school. So for those schools, they do reserve half the seats for kids who live within a certain mile, ripping off families, or ripping off taxpayers. But some of them are good. And some of them are genuinely trying. So I would say, I'm not, if I were king, I wouldn't be creating lots of virtual schools. You want some for kids who, for one reason or another, just can't thrive going to a school. But you don't want a whole lot of them, I think. And the key, I guess, is good authorizing. The authorizer of all those virtual schools should be doing its job. And if the virtual school is really a scam, it should be closed down.
All right, this is a shameless plug, but at 2:30, we're going to go deeper into this conversation, David and others, and it's going to be a lively conversation. So get your energy drink and make sure you're there at 2:30.
Excellent. That's great.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.